Welcome back to Theories of Knowledge, the first collaborative online course for arts and humanities doctoral students across Scotland, brought to you by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities with support from the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Scottish Funding Council. Theories of Knowledge examines the ways in which philosophers and critical theorists, have influenced and continue to animate how we understand knowledge production within arts and humanities fields. The 10-week series is delivered live and online by leading researchers from member institutions of the Scottish Graduate School, and our participants hail from across the disciplines and around the country. This evening, Professor Michael Brown will deliver the third lecture in our series, Reclaiming Enlightenment. Professor Brown is an historian of Ireland, Scotland, and Britain more widely, with particular interest in the Enlightenment and the political culture of the 18th century. Awarded a personal chair in Irish, Scottish, and Enlightenment history in 2014, Professor Brown was appointed to a lectureship at Aberdeen in 2006 and promoted to senior lecturer in 2011. Professor Brown's work concerns the Irish and Scottish Enlightenments. He is interested in the interaction between religious, political, and ethical ideas in the 18th century. He is author of The Irish Enlightenment, out from Harvard in 2016, a political biography of John Toland, out from Routledge in 2011, and Francis Hutcheson in Dublin, 1719 to 1730, The Crucible of His Thought, Four Courts, 2002, as well as numerous articles and book chapters, and he has edited multiple collections. He lectures regularly in Britain, Ireland, and North America. Today, Professor Brown will speak to us about how scholars of intellectual history from the 1960s to the present have reclaimed and perhaps reshaped the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers, focusing especially on the work of Rousseau. I have a quick note for those of you attending remotely tonight. As always, we'll take live questions and comments from our online forum following the lecture. Please log on to knowtheory.org, knowtheory.org, and navigate to the Reclaiming Enlightenment post on the discussion page. I look forward to talking with you.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Katie, and thank you for the invitation to come and lecture. You mentioned that much of my work focuses on Britain and Ireland, but what I really want to do this evening is to take you across to France. And the reason for that is I want to kind of tell you a bit of a fable, which I hope will find some general interest and will reflect on some of the problems and questions that we were discussing in thinking about how a lecture of this kind might be integrated into the series. In particular, I want to try and think about the ways in which the Enlightenment as a topic has been rethought and reimagined repeatedly in the period really since the Second War, but more specifically in recent years with the rise of cultural and intellectual history and the linguistic turn and so forth. So that's kind of one of the areas of interest. The other thing that I wanted to try and do, and what this lecture will try and do, is sort of bump together two ideas and watch the friction a little bit, and hopefully some sparks of illumination will then follow. But what I want to try and do is to bring together two ideas that might perhaps find a point of reference within the writings of Karl Marx, who I understand was alluded to in the last lecture. And the first of these comes from perhaps his most famous moment of writing, and Marx is, after all, a terrific writer. It tends to be Engels who sort of turns it into a kind of more harsh and leaden prose. Marx himself was a very gifted stylist. Marx has, at the opening of the Communist Manifesto, the assertion that there's a spectre haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And in a sense, what I want to try and think about this evening is the ways in which what Marx is driving at here is that there's an idea that is afloat and abound in the world. The bourgeoisie are terrified by the idea of the mob, are terrified by the idea that the mob is going to become politicized and the mob is going to become radicalized and revolutionary. And what the Communist Manifesto then does is try and embody that idea, to give it a kind of physical manifestation, and to say effectively, in simple terms, if this is what you are scared of, I'll be it. I'll be a communist. I will claim that moment, that idea, and to embody that idea. So what Marx is talking about here is what he subsequently will call praxis, theory in action. And that's one idea I want to try and think about tonight a little bit the ways in which ideas relate to revolutionary and political action. And specifically revolutionary, because the second idea I want to sort of put into play might be drawn from, if you like, from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which is a reflection on, rather interesting reflection on the ways in which revolutions fail. And Marx is good at failed revolutions. 1848 doesn't work out as planned either. Quite a lot of his writing is reflecting on political action that doesn't quite go as planned. But Marx writes in the 18th Brumaire, in the second paragraph, men make their own history, but they do not make it in circumstances of their own choosing. Marx is often read as a kind of determinist. There's a kind of preordained nature of the development of history. But actually, in reading Marx, what you discover is that while history might be predetermined, your own actions within that historical pattern, that emergence of a communist utopia, aren't. You can choose which side of history you're going to be on. And in a sense, this relates him to a kind of religious notion about whether or not one can work towards the coming of the second coming of Christ. Marx, of course, is Jewish, so that's a slight allusion across into this. But my point is really that what Marx is trying to do, what Marx is thinking about, is the ways in which human beings find themselves interpreting their circumstances and rendering a history that is useful to them. And that's the second idea that I want to try and think about, the ways in which history writing itself becomes a product of historical time. So those are the two things that I'm thinking about: the relationship between loosely termed ideas and political action, or to translate it into 18th century terms, the relationship between the Enlightenment and revolution, that grand historical problem that has a literature that dates right back to at least Tocqueville and his writings on the Ancien regime and the French Revolution, and the idea that history itself is the product of history. History writing is itself the product of history. And the way I want to think about this, I told you I'd tell you a fable. Well, what I want to try and do is to rather take these rather grand ideas and focus them down into something much more particular. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this man, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I'm going to think about the ways in which the literature that has emerged around Rousseau can be thought of as emblematic of a series of historiographical twists and turns that have taken place. The way in which we treat Rousseau tells us quite a lot about how we're thinking about these bigger problems to do with the relationship between the factual person and the history that we write, and indeed the relationship between ideas and political action. Why so? Well, the very easy way to begin, sort of at the kernel of it, is a debate that takes place between Rousseau, here dressed in what I think is Armenian peasant garb for reasons that are rather unclear, and David Hume, who is pictured here also by Alan Ramsey, propped up on his most successful publication, which rather helpfully for my purposes was a history of England. And Hume and Rousseau met with each other in 1766 when Rousseau had fled Paris, where he had been hanging out and arguing with people across the city, notably Denis Diderot. He'd fled Paris thinking that Diderot was involved in a grand conspiracy to do down Rousseau's public reputation. And so he turned up in London. And in meeting with Hume in London, he thought initially he had found an ally and a friend. But what he subsequently decided, partly because Hume seems to have had an academic stare, which meant that he looked through people when he was thinking about ideas, this unnerved Rousseau. And Rousseau decided that, in fact, what had happened was that Diderot had very carefully placed him into the care of Hume to dissuade him from hanging out in Paris and to put him into the clutches of a much greater European-wide conspiracy to do down Rousseau. So Hume took umbrage at this and published a series of letters which explained his side of the story and subsequently did down Rousseau's reputation, rather intriguingly. In other words, Rousseau and Hume didn't like each other. And what I want to try and think about is the consequences of that argument. Why, in effect, is that important? Well, one of the reasons why I think it's important is because, in historiographical terms at least, David Hume is one of the great heroes of Peter Gay's grand study, The Enlightenment and Interpretation, published in 2 volumes in 1966 and 1969, respectively. Peter Gay's The Enlightenment is one of the major works of interpretation of the Enlightenment as an intellectual project and a historical phenomenon. It has this double-edged quality to it. It's been described as the kind of in a historical centaur. It's part philosophy and part. The Enlightenment can be treated as part philosophy and part history, and it's a kind of problem as how you tease out and weigh the different elements of its nature. But Peter Gay is fairly clear about this. What he argues is that the Enlightenment was of significance because it embodied certain universal values. Hume is the hero of the second volume, known as subtitled The Science of Freedom. And in the first volume, we have a hero as this hero, Voltaire. Voltaire is treated as a neoclassical figure, or neo-pagan in Gay's handling, and as a kind of arch-rationalist. Voltaire's position is one entirely driven by a kind of anti-clerical edge, and Voltaire's politics is the subject of one of Peter Gay's other monographs. So Voltaire is treated in the light of a kind of a rationalist deist, and believing in a kind of clockmaker god who sets the world in motion and then subsequently walks away. Of course, this kind of version of Voltaire is both accurate and somewhat elusive, precisely because Voltaire himself struggles with this image in his most famous work, Candide, in which the idea of a rationalist god is a deistic god, a god in which all is best in the best of all possible worlds, is roundly mocked in the light of the Lisbon earthquake. In Gay's handling, though, this kind of neoclassical, paganistic rationalist is coupled by a study of Hume as profoundly skeptical and anti-clerical. He's fundamentally making mock of a kind of religious sensibility he found in 18th century Edinburgh. Joined together, Hume and Voltaire make up a kind of double-headed eagle of a 1960s vision of a liberal and radical Enlightenment. And Peter Gay's The Enlightenment offers us a kind of Enlightenment that fits the moment of the age. It is an Enlightenment, if you like, for the Woodstock generation. The difficulty here is that in that modelling, Rousseau doesn't really fit. And indeed, in some ways, Rousseau becomes belittled by Gay's handling as one of the bickering bedfellows of the Enlightenment family. The lovely essay by Gay in one of his collections about how the Enlightenment is a bickering family. And Rousseau is clearly the sibling who's decided to slam the door and take his football and go play somewhere else. Rousseau, in that regard, becomes a challenge to the Voltairean Humean model of the Enlightenment that Gay is promulgating. So why does that matter? Well, we need then, I think, to turn our attention to Rousseau himself and see whether or not we can make some degree of sense of him. Rousseau's position was that he was in fact already an outsider by birth. He was born not in France but in Geneva in 1712. And he's quite proud of this fact. He puts himself up and says, well, on his frontispieces of some of his works, he declares himself to be a citizen of Geneva. And he openly expresses the view that Geneva is a more virtuous, more republican, more well-managed polity than France. And that places him into a position in which he can openly critique French politics and society. Rousseau himself is a kind of piece of European driftwood who wanders about trying to make some sense of the environment he's in. He feels isolated and alienated from polite society. Feels like an outsider. He shows up in Paris with a new model of musical notation which goes nowhere. And he really struggles to find a role for himself until he is, and this is typical of Rousseau, you can choose which version of the story you want to believe, because there are multiple versions of this story, but he's puzzled out by an essay question about the role of the arts and sciences in civilizing Europe. And in his discourse on the arts and sciences, what he simply offers is a counterintuitive answer. Now, this may or may not have been the result of Diderot rather ironically turning around to Rousseau and saying, by the way, why don't you just argue the opposite from the norm, that arts and sciences are not beneficial to society. Rousseau, in one version of the story, says this came as a revelation, this Diderotian kind of moment of just, paradox play. Oh, why don't we just turn this around and see what happens? Diderot's great at this. He writes book reviews that are longer than the book that he's reviewing to try and think out the question of what he's trying to do. So there's all that kind of creativity sparking off of Diderot. And it's either that Rousseau finds, well, whatever way that the story emerges, Rousseau finds in this a revelation about the nature of European society as being retrograde and not progressive, that then subsequently informs his critique of 18th century France. That's why, in a sense, Rousseau's position in relation to the Enlightenment becomes much more problematic. Rousseau is already, as Mark Hulling has nicely described it, as he's already in the position of being the kind of an auto-critique of the Enlightenment. He's an interior critic of the project of intellectual progression that he sees around him. But the difficulty is that his position then allows him to be co-opted for a number of polemical uses when the Enlightenment is being reconfigured and reimagined in the post-war period, post-Second World War. In particular, in the 1950s, Rousseau becomes associated quite strongly through his writing on the social contract with what J.L. Talman describes as the origins of totalitarian democracy, or totalitarian democracy writ large. The book, Talman's book, published in 1952, threads the origins of Nazism back to Rousseau's concept of the general will found in the social contract. And the social contract, published in 1762, had argued for a model of democracy which Talman contended pushed for the tyranny of majorities. What Rousseau argued was that rather than being asked for our individual view of any particular policy idea and voting on this matter on a kind of rolling basis, there has this idea in the social contract of a kind of rolling plebiscite. What Rousseau says is that once the vote is taken, those people who have decided that they are opposed to the bill should simply quieten down and accept that the general will of the society has determined that what is good for the society is in fact the proposition in play. This leads to the potential for permanent minorities. If you're in a position in which, as a member of a minority community, you are persistently going to be voted down, you will never get your way in politics. And Rousseau's solution to this is simple. Well, either you put up or you leave. And that idea that there's a kind of totalitarian quality to the majoritarian decision of democracy, and there's no checks and balances built into the system, leads Talman to associate Rousseau with the idea of fascism. This chimes with a whole series of other works of intellectual archaeology, if you like, conducted in the 1950s. Perhaps most famously, Isaiah Berlin's radio talk of 1952, the same year as Talman's book came out, Joseph de Maistre and the Origins of Fascism, which is published later in a book called The Crooked Timber of Humanity, which again tracks back the ideas that were embodied in fascism to the context of the French Revolution. And that's really what is happening in Talman's book, and indeed in Berlin's wider work, is looking for origin points for the mid-20th century trauma of the Holocaust. And Talman is offering us, if you will, a Rousseau for the Holocaust generation, trying to work out why it is that the kind of political ideas that are embodied in the Enlightenment and are thought of as progressive, tolerant, cosmopolitan, and so forth, have been distorted to the extent that the Holocaust becomes an imagined possibility and ultimately a terrifying reality. In other words, one of the issues at stake inside of the Hume-Rousseau debate, which I suggested was important, was the antagonism that's expressed between a high Enlightenment figure like David Hume, author of the history of, or a treatise of human nature, author of an essay debunking the idea of religious miracles, author of a major historical exposition of the rise of liberty in the English Constitution. That model of a high Enlightenment can be dissociated from the terror, which is why my slide shows Robespierre and the execution of Robespierre. That modeling of Hume and Rousseau arguing dissociates the high Enlightenment of the mid-century from the terror, which is then associated with Rousseau's antagonism to the Enlightenment and his influence, his claimed influence on Robespierre. So by associating Rousseau with a critique of the Enlightenment, Enlightenment scholarship can then safely hive away the French Revolution and the terror, more specifically, and that totalitarian democracy from the Enlightenment claim to tolerance, cosmopolitanism, and so forth. In other words, Rousseau's position and his politics helps explain how the liberal Enlightenment either went awry or was safeguarded from the consequences of political revolution. Hume and Voltaire's liberal revolution, according to subsequently Peter Gay, is destroyed by a Rousseauian-inspired Jacobin revolution in 1793, headed up by that ideological figure and that polemical figure of the French Revolution period, Robespierre. So it's a neat model. The Enlightenment occurs, the French Revolution occurs, and the liberal Enlightenment, the liberal phase of the French Revolution can be salvaged from the consequences of the terror by associating the Declaration of the Rights of Man with Voltaire and associating the terror with Robespierre. It makes life intellectually very neat. The difficulty is that the social contract, which is the key text in this interpretation, simply wasn't read by anybody in the 18th century much. In fact, what was read was a whole set of other works by Rousseau. And that irritating historical detail starts to destabilize this narrative of the relationship between Enlightenment and progress and Rousseau and retrogression. And what we're forced to do then is to rethink Rousseau. And we can start to do so by turning ourselves to a kind of key work by John Starobinski, originally published in 1957, but crucially reprinted in 1971, entitled Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Transparency and Obstacle. What Starobinski claims is that Rousseau's primary concern was not with democracy, akin as it was to the reading that we would find in the 1950s in Talman, but in fact was much more concerned with issues of truth, and in particular with being seen to be honest, transparency. The heart of this reading lies, in a sense, a rendition of Rousseau's Confessions, this kind of core text of autobiographical writing that Rousseau offered up, in which he explains what an unpleasant human being he actually is. I have to admit, and this is kind of a little bit of an aside, Rousseau is not my favorite of the Enlightenment philosophers. He goes out of his way to appear rather unpleasant. And in the Confessions, he pretty much achieves that goal. He describes himself as a liar. He describes himself as sadomasochistic. He describes himself as deeply distrusting, and it goes forward and it goes forward. And the Confessions is, in a sense, a kind of an extraordinary expose of the self. It sits alongside the Life of Johnson by James Boswell as one of the great pieces of biographical writing of the 18th century. But where Boswell has done is produce a sort of social portrait of Johnson. This is Johnson in conversation. This is Johnson in society. This is Johnson in kind of intimate dialogue with Boswell. What we find in Rousseau is a kind of interior portrait. Rousseau is constantly telling us how he feels, what his emotions are. And he describes how, as in this illustration, how he gets up to things he shouldn't. This is him stealing. He's also, however, interested in the production of the difference between appearance and actuality. He tells a rather interesting story early on in the Confessions about the breaking of a comb. A comb had been sitting on an oven, on top of an oven, and had broken by the heat. But when the adults arrive, they accuse the young child, as he then was, Rousseau, of having broken it, and he denies such a thing. And they make the point, rightly, that he was the only one in the room at the time, and it must be him, and there's no point in lying about it, and so on and so forth. So the appearance of him of having destroyed the comb is in fact contrary to the reality. And Rousseau describes this as a kind of key revelation, that what the social self performs and what the reality is can be very, very different. The interior reality can be very, very different. And we may well all have that sense that we perform differently in different places and spaces. We perform differently in a lecture hall than we do in a public house. Strange, but true. And in that regard, Rousseau begins to expose and begins to become fascinated by the difference between the reality of an emotional experience and the observations of. And what he's trying to do, Starobinsky argues in this work, is to bring those two things back together, to bring the authentic self and the social self back into focus, and to sort of align them so that they are comfortable together. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters on a macro scale because Rousseau also claims that in this description of the social environment lies the capacity to describe society. In that capacity lies the origins of inequality. And in his discourse on the origins and foundation of inequality of 1764, he fully admits there are natural discrepancies. I may be weak, I may be strong, I may be fast, I may be slow. There is a whole series of natural inequalities between human beings. But what he's interested in really is the capacity to impose one's will on another, to make the appearance that you see be the one that carries social weight. And in particular, is an extraordinary passage in which he describes how the origins of property itself lies in the claim to ownership, which is a linguistic and social claim. As he puts it in the discourse, the first time, the origins of property lie in the first time that anyone put a fence around a piece of land, said this is mine, and found somebody fool enough to believe that it was so. Property, and from which all other forms of inequality, subsequently social inequality, follow, resides in a false claim to over reality, Rousseau argues. So in other words, what you're finding is a discussion in Starobinsky of a debate about power, appearance, and distrust. And what Rousseau is looking for is a kind of bringing together of the breaking down of the social appearances to the point where they are genuinely natural. And you can then subsequently read this into some of his other writings, most notably his celebration of natural men in the social contract, and the idea that there's a kind of pre-social human being. In the world before power comes into play, what was the natural human being like becomes one of the subject areas that Rousseau interrogates. Now, this concern with the deceptive quality of power, the capacity of power to claim that things are true when they are palpably not so, and to make that claim matter, provides us with a kind of Rousseau for the Watergate generation. Now, Rousseau built into the kind of 1970s distrust of power. And the key figure here is perhaps Michel Foucault. Foucault offers us a kind of post-structuralist interpretation of the Enlightenment as inherently, in a very Rousseauian gesture, a bad thing. In this, he draws on, in some ways, Adorno and Horkheimer's much earlier work of 1947, of the dialectic of the Enlightenment, but where Horkheimer and Adorno have offered us a Marxist attack on the culture industry and argued that the Enlightenment effectively produces a kind of consumerism that will lead us to a kind of soft-minded folly. What Foucault argues is much deeper, I think. What Foucault does is he delves into what he describes as the archaeological aspects of the Enlightenment and looks at the wider discourse, the truth claims that are being made on the part of the Enlightenment project. Most notable of these is the idea that human beings are rational. Because if the Enlightenment is capable of providing us with a definition of rationality and offering up that idea of rationality as equating to an idea of normality. In other words, human beings are rational, and rationality means a certain set of things, and that model of rationality is therefore normal. Failing to meet the definition of rational offered to us by the Enlightenment produces a counter-definition of human beings as irrational and somehow abnormal. And Foucault conducts, in a series of major interpretations, an exploration of the generation of this idea of normality, what it is to be normal in Enlightenment terms, and what the consequences are of generating a definition of normality for those who are deemed to be abnormal. Discipline in Polish, published in 1975, opens up this kind of investigation to the issue of prisons, looking at how social abnormality through crime and deviance can be used to understand developments in the 18th century around housing people in prisons. His argument, roughly, in kind of thumbnail version, is that prior to the 18th century, the ambition was to discipline the body, or sorry, to punish the body. Human beings would be, if they were found guilty of crime, would be physically punished for doing so. There's a move in the late 18th century, led by figures like John Howard in England and Cesare Beccaria in Italy, to argue for not the direct punishment of criminals, but their rehabilitation through imprisonment and retraining. What Foucault argues is that, in fact, what they're being inducted into is into a mental discipline in which they will learn normal behavior. And that definition of normality is actually deeply constrictive. He more widely argues this in a couple of studies concerned with medicine. Notably the birth of the clinic of 1961, which really feeds into a much wider intellectual movement around the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s, and the idea that in effect any definition of normality that might be offered in mental health terms was problematic. This is also informed by the Scottish writer and philosopher R.D. Laing. Foucault's argument is that mentally unwell individuals were commonly dealt with in the medieval period by simply treatment within the community, that they were seen quite often as having special insight indeed, and a particular and unique insight into the nature of reality and human existence. It's only, he contends, really in the 18th century that you develop an idea of a normal, healthy human being, which is then constricted, or then constricts the possibility of abnormality. It generates a definition of abnormality and then imposes, again, a disciplining of abnormality through the creation of hospitals. You can see there's a theme here of institutionalization running through Foucault's work. And ultimately, he then explores, in the History of Sexuality, published in 3 volumes between 1976 and 84, the imposition of ideas of normal sexuality onto society. All of the time exploring how the 18th century and the Enlightenment narrowed the possibilities of human endeavor by defining rational humanity as normal and giving us a very strict and limiting definition of rationality itself. Now, he doesn't dwell much on Rousseau, but this attack, this broad attack on the Enlightenment as retrogressive is kind of Rousseauian in character, indeed. And this use of ideas which germinate from Rousseau culminates, as a way of attacking the Enlightenment, culminates in the 1980s with the idea that the Enlightenment itself was a bad thing and should be discarded, which becomes a kind of common declaration of philosophical independence in the writings of the many writings in the 1980s. We move into a kind of a self-declared post-Enlightenment period, and nowhere more so than in taking the linguistic turn, precisely because what the linguistic turn does is try and remove an idea of language as having a reference point in reality, that to describe something is to, in fact, relate directly over to its reality, that there is an object and the word that we have references a specific object, and to see language instead as part of individual words as occupying a space in a broader discourse. So words don't refer to objects, they refer themselves to other words effectively. And that language can separate and float free of the reality of lived experience. This is where we get, in its particularly Pyrrhonian expression, skeptical expression, deconstructionist work, where language in effect has its own fluid power that even the author doesn't entirely control, and you get the possibility of multiple meanings that play out. And what I read into a text may not be what the author intended, and so too it doesn't have any necessary relationship to the reality that it purports to describe. That linguistic turn, which has some origins in French linguistic philosophy and also in late Wittgenstein. There's a point in about early 1990s where everybody just seemed to be wanting to be late Wittgenstein, and kept trying to refer to late Wittgenstein. But that really finds a grounding in the writings of Paul de Man and Jacques Derrida, both of whom write extensively on Rousseau. Paul de Man in Allegories of Reading, 1979, who explores the Confessions, and Derrida in Of Grammatology of 1967, but the influence, as you might remark, comes rather later, who explores the essay on the origin of language, both of whom are deeply concerned with the ways in which language doesn't refer to the reality of the situation. That, if you like, the Rousseauian problem of appearance and power and authenticity. Paul de Man, it should be said himself, gets some, has a problematic status in this, precisely because it's revealed that he wrote propaganda in the 1940s for a pro-Nazi newspaper in Belgium. So there's kind of issues around the reality and truth claims that play out here. Derrida, much more specifically, is interested in the philosophical position that's being maintained here. More widely, this finds a broad expression in Richard Rorty's 1979 work, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, which argues that the idea that language should mirror nature and be an accurate representation is problematic. And what you find here is a concern throughout these writings with Rousseau as a kind of skeptic about literary power and seeing language as a way of deploying power. So, and also with Rousseau, therefore, as an untrustworthy narrator. The very fact that the kind of key moment when he decides that Western civilization is in fact a story of decay and decline rather than one of progress can be told multiple ways is something that interests them. They're intrigued by the way in which Rousseau himself constantly re-performs his own existence. Now this all fits in with a kind of decline in the legitimacy of ideological politics as experienced in the 1980s. A sense, if you will, of foreboding about the power of largely Marxist philosophical writing to accurately describe social reality, which culminates in debates around the French Revolution, with the writings of Francois Furet offering a completely non-Marxist interpretation of the French Revolution in interpreting the French Revolution of 1981, and in his last work, published in 1995, his denunciation of the politics of communism in The Passing of the Illusion. In other words, one way to think about the anxiety of language that's expressed, and language's power in that's expressed in the 1980s, and Rousseau's role in that, is to think of this Rousseau being a Rousseau for the cultural war generation, and a sense of the anxiety about the decline and fall of the power of ideological politics, those truth claims that ideological politics makes on reality, starting to come under significant intellectual question. This, of course, suggests, in fact, not a decline of the capacity for a description of Rousseau, but the possibility of its re-narration and remobilization, which is something that we see in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, with the rise of cultural history. And rather wonderfully, for anyone who cares for Marxist philosophy, it finds its root in a study of the means of production. Robert Darnton's rather unread, it has to be said, of all the works I think Darnton has produced, it's the least read. My supervisor back in the day told me to go read it, so I diligently went and did so. It's called The Business of Enlightenment. It's a publishing history of the Encyclopédie, published in 1979. And what Darnton does is explore in that work how the book actually came to be published. It's a kind of book about a book without talking about the ideas in that book. It's a kind of idealist book in that sense. He's not interested in what articles were written by who and what they argued. He's interested in how the book came to be published and who did the heavy lifting of actually putting the text onto the page and distributing it across France. And what he uncovers is, in a sense, a decentered Enlightenment, based in Neuchâtel, more than in Paris, and a deeply provincial in its readership. In other words, he's interested in Enlightenment as a mode of production. And this has had a kind of lengthy history, which most recently perhaps finds expression in Clifford Siskin and Williams Warner's edited collection, This is Enlightenment, of 2010, which argues that Enlightenment is itself a form of mediation. And they are associating this, and this is an avenue we could explore, with the kind of media revolution of our own lifetimes and the ways in which the possibility of information being redistributed in new and exciting ways is embodying what they describe as a re-enlightenment project. Darnton takes it in a rather different direction. What Darnton argues is that there was a high and grand enlightenment in the mid-18th century, the enlightenment of Diderot and of Montesquieu and of the big books of that period, and that they in effect filled up the cultural spaces available in 18th century France. But they inspired a whole lot of other people to try out their hand as writers. And what this produced was a group of highly educated, often highly educated, but underemployed intellectuals. What Darnton terms the gutter Rousseauians, who turned their attention to the destruction of the politics that excluded them from power. And there comes a process of what's termed by Roger Chartier, who in many ways is an antagonist of Darnton, but shares in this concern, a desacralization of the monarchy. Unable to get themselves into the Académie Française, unable to get themselves positions at the university, these unemployed figures, or underemployed figures, turned their hand to critique and criticism. And in particular, as Darnton has done much to empirically show, they turned their hand to the writing of pornography and libel and caricature. And they produced a vehement and destructive intellectual attack on the monarchy and the politics of the monarchy of the Ancien regime. And in that way, lent their hand to the idea of the desacralization of the monarchy, that the monarchy was not God-given, but was in fact cronyistic, corrupt, sexually profligate, and destructive of the common good. And in particular, that finds a focus in the position of the foreign-born Queen, Marie Antoinette. And it's Marie Antoinette who becomes the kind of focal point of this attack on the French revolutionary politics. Now the problem here is, in a sense, that this replicates in a very different way and a slightly different formulation, with a very different formulation, the same structure of understanding that you find in Talman's 1950s rendering of the Enlightenment, and indeed Peter Gay's Enlightenment, in which Rousseau, who becomes a kind of a hero, a great hero for these underemployed critics of the Enlightenment, is separated out from the Enlightenment proper, leaving us with a nice, safe, liberal, democratic Enlightenment personified by Diderot, and with a darker, more destructive force, a kind of radical Enlightenment personified by Rousseau. And one of the issues around which this turns is an argument that Rousseau has with salon culture, and in particular with the idea that women dominate in salon conversation, that the salonière sets the rules for polite and civil discourse. And Rousseau found this, frankly, offensive to his sense of male autonomy. And it's very gendered, this discussion. Dina Goodman, in a book called The Republic of Letters, has laid this out very nicely. And in fact, one of the problems with Rousseau more generally is that he is indeed highly antagonistic to women. His wife, I did tell you, he's not the nicest bloke you're going to meet. His wife, this is she, Marie-Thérèse Levasseur, he leaves largely illiterate, unlike Diderot, who makes great efforts to help his daughter Sophie learn and to be educated and to engage in philosophical discussion, Rousseau simply shows no interest. He's equally dismissive of children, it has to be said. He sees them as a tie, and he sends each of his children systematically to an orphanage where, given mortality rates in 18th century France, they were basically condemned to death. All of this is to avoid any sense of social obligation on his part. It leaves him free to continue. Now, this version of an Enlightenment, which is broadly speaking about the development then of a critical public sphere, this late Enlightenment, chimes with work that's been done by Jürgen Habermas, who's become a kind of lodestone of a certain kind of Enlightenment discourse and his idea of a public sphere, and Michael Warner, whose interest in a counter-public sphere, a kind of critical public sphere, and in interest in gender history, and all sort of feeds into a model of the Enlightenment as, on the one hand, liberal and democratic in the handling of somebody like Keith Michael Baker, but is saved from the terror and the destructive forces of revolution through the process of Rousseauian blame. You can blame Rousseau for this. That was the fault. What it does allow us to begin to explain, this model of a press culture that attacks, a kind of burgeoning press culture that attacks the central focus point of power, is a kind of, it allows us to sort of draw a parallel between the Enlightenment, the late Enlightenment, and the final collapse of communism. That it is the re-emergence of civil society in the 1980s in Poland, in Hungary, and in the then Yugoslavia, that helps to formulate a critique of communism that pushes us towards the collapse of the communist regimes across Eastern Europe. This is a Rousseau, in other words, for the Berlin Wall generation. And there is a strong sense in which that idea of civil society, which is rediscovered in political theory at the time by writers like Ernst Gellner or John Keane, embodies a kind of understanding of critical democratic debate as antagonistic to power, which is mirrored in the treatment of Rousseau and of the late Enlightenment in writings by Darnton and others. Now, the problem with all of this is that all of this so far has treated Rousseau as effectively a political cipher. So various generations of historians have reimagined the possibility of Rousseau as a political figure and deployed him for political ends that correlate rather uneasily at times with current political concerns that their own generation are struggling with. The difficulty is that, in fact, Rousseau was read in the 18th century not as a political theorist. Indeed, The Social Contract, as I mentioned before, was rather unread, but as a novelist. The biggest seller was a novel called Julie, or the New Heloise, of 1761, in which what you find is a kind of sentimentalism and not severity as the key tone. And what you produce, in particular, the one that's now read most frequently, is in fact Emile of 1762, which is about how a natural human being might be created. It's an essay on education. How do we save people from the corrupting power of society? And this idea of Emile as a natural boy, saved from the authoritarian and destructive powers of sociability and of institutionality, offers us a model for understanding Rousseau as part of a wider reading of the history of emotions that burgeoned in the 1990s, and gave us a sense of Rousseau as concerned with authenticity, with self-expression, and with the possibility of autonomous virtue, choosing to be good because it's in your very nature to be so. And this idea of Rousseau as effectively interested in self-realization is a kind of Rousseau, if you like, for the fin de siècle, a world of consumerism, a world of a burgeoning economy both in Europe and in North America, where the long boom of the 1990s is coupled with an interest in self-expression, in therapy culture, and in the finding of oneself and grounding of oneself in New Age thinking about selfhood. So where are we at now? What I've tried to do is to track across the course of this lecture a series of moments in Rousseau's historiography which talk to the way in which history writing has changed and altered and has fluctuated depending on current contemporaneous concerns. Where we stand now is in a kind of post-9/11 generational moment. To read Rousseau now is to find in him a return, or in the literature on him, is to find an interest in his religious ideas, expressed in the creed of the Savoyard priest in Emile in 1762, and more particularly, and that chimes with work more generally in historical writing by Michael Burley on earthly powers, on John Gray's interest in Black Mass, on the politicization of religion, and so forth. There's a whole literature on the re-emergence of religion as a category of social experience, unlike civil society of the 1990s or 1980s, late 1980s. What we're now looking at is religion being one of the key terms of critical debate. But perhaps most interestingly, what I find most interesting in Rousseauian literature is a concern for the return of what we might describe paranoia. Perhaps the most important work now in the rendering of Rousseau could be thought to be not the Confessions or the Social Contract or any of the major works as have been treated to date, but his last work, an incomplete publication published after his death in 1782, Reveries of a Solitary Walker, in which he expounds upon his sense of paranoia about the people around him, his sense that society is making demands on him to behave in certain ways that he finds wholly inappropriate and is uncomfortable in fulfilling, and he's interested in exploring and rendering for posterity his documentation of the conspiracy that has done him down. Now this feeds into a much wider literature on conspiracy theory and terror that has flooded into the market in the years since 9/11. I have to admit I picked up on some of this myself in my treatment of John Toland as a conspiracy theorist. But that's just a kind of minor aside. But more broadly, you can look at something like Marissa Linton's recent book, Choosing Terror, Virtue, Friendship, and Authenticity in the French Revolution. You can look at Adam Zimowski's Phantom Terror, The Threat of Revolution and the Repression of Liberty of 2015, and a whole array of critical and political political theory work on conspiracy theory that's emerged. Indeed, last night, as it happens, because I'm strange and odd this way, I was listening to a podcast about conspiracy theories on a piece called Philosophy Bites, and Rousseau was cited as a key figure in the kind of philosophy of conspiracy. That is not to say that conspiracies are all necessarily and wholly negative. There can be, indeed, conspiracies of the virtuous. And in Jonathan Israel's major series of studies on the Enlightenment, Radical Enlightenment of 2001, Enlightenment Contested of 2006, Democratic Enlightenment of 2011, and ultimately Revolutionary Ideas and Intellectual History of the French Revolution, from the Rights of Man to Robespierre, rather interestingly, 2014. In all of these, what you find is a rendition of the Enlightenment as a kind of conspiracy of the virtuous. Originating point in Spinoza, a small and select group of virtuous cognoscenti who know the real story and understand the nature of reality, and they are fighting the case for Enlightenment progress. There's work on conspiracy theory in the French Revolution. There's work on conspiracy theory across the 18th century as a whole. All of this feeds us back to a Rousseauian concern with the idea that Hume was out to get him, that Hume was a figure who was, in fact, at the center of a European-wide conspiracy to do down Rousseau's public reputation. This Rousseau for the 9/11 generation finds its way back to the row in London in 1766 between a figure at the forefront of what's thought to, as modelled by historians, to be a progressive, sceptical, liberal, tolerant Enlightenment, and an Enlightenment that understands the darker, shadowy aspects of power, of social control, and of personal and public expectation. So Rousseau then matters, and the row between Rousseau and Hume, I think, matters because he gives us a litmus test, if you will, about how we think about key areas of philosophical and historical concern. That centaur again, that double-headed, that strange amalgam of history and philosophy. Namely, he cites us in the relationship between Enlightenment and revolution. He puts us, in other words, to think about the questions of political change and political violence. He involves us in conversations about ideas and action, the praxis that drove forward much of Marx's philosophical interest. How do the ideas of Voltaire relate to the actions of the French revolutionaries? Do they? And in what way? To quote another source entirely, W.B. Yeats quizzed about whether, what did the play he wrote send men out to be shot? That question of the relationship between literature and political action and literature and political change is one that Rousseau embodies. He also asks us questions about the relationship between individualism and sociability, what it is to be a human being when social expectations drive you to do things. As I jokingly say sometimes to my colleagues, what gets me out of the bed in the morning is fear, mainly fear. That I'd fail expectations and that things don't get done because I wasn't there and I ducked my responsibility. But is that really me? Am I not am I most me, as romantics later say, when I'm out at play? Or am I really myself when I'm fulfilling the expectations of others? Or am I myself when I'm free of those expectations and I'm full of self-expression? That tension, if you will, between an Enlightenment model of fulfilling one's duty and being a rational and contained human being, and that romantic idea of human beings as most themselves when free of responsibility and expressing themselves through creative arts, is embodied in Rousseau. And finally, as I hope I've tried to play out here, there's a relationship between knowledge and understanding. In other words, the Rousseau who walks around in London in 1766 can be read as a whole series of possible human beings. And history writing itself becomes the subject of interpretation in that way. That what we make of Rousseau is informed by our own historicity, our own moment in time. And in that regard, reflecting on historiography produces an understanding of history as itself the product of history. So, thank you very much.